so that's why I titled my little chat today, Helen of the River, a relevant muse, because there's so many aspects to her life and her times during the Great Depression that are relevant to today. First of all, let me untangle myself. This is my first book. I've been a photojournalist, a journalist, a magazine writer. I've worked for Walter Husband at the Democrat and later the Democrat Gazette. So I've paid my dues. And when I was asked to write a book about Helen Spence, it was 4 years after I had written a little bio for the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. And if there are young people in the audience, I see some, and if you have young people in your family, please avail yourself and take this information to the schools. The Encyclopedia of Arkansas is a wonderful resource. So I wrote this little 800-word biography about Helen Spence after my family and I had been living in Hot Springs, and I've always wanted to learn more about the White River. When we drove over the bridge to get here and I saw the beautiful, clear running waters of the upper White River, it was the first time I had seen this area in almost 20 years. I can't tell you how glad I am to be back here. But when I was a child, my family actually had a houseboat near Clarendon, which is on the lower White River, where it's a lot wider, and that's where the river people, some call them river rats. I wouldn't recommend it. But the river people lived there and thrived, and they made buttons out of mussel shells. They picked mussel shells up out of the bed of the river. They hunted, they trapped, they fished, until the dams were built. At which point the temperature of the river plummeted, the mussels diminished, so many species, native species of fish were killed by this dam building. But the White River still survives, and if you want to know about Helen Spence, you have to imagine a time before the dams when people were still living sustainably, they were thriving, even during the Great Depression. So the way it relates to my curiosity was my family had a houseboat. It was beautiful to me, and there was, outdoor WC, the whole bit. We swam, we fished, we took baths in the river. I was a little girl, and then one day when I was about, I guess, 6 years old, 5 or 6, the Corps of Engineers generated a bunch of water out of the dam, and it washed away our houseboat, which was up on the riverbank at that point, because all the river people were banished from living on the river right around the time that Helen Spence was murdered. So this convergence of history, and in one young woman, she was only a teenager, just spoke to me because I met a man in Hot Springs, and he's 88 years old. He said to tell y'all hi. He can't travel right now, but he grew up with Helen Spence. His name is L.C. Brown. I had to write him into the book. He's in the book. You can see his baby pictures. It's awesome. He's a wonderful human being. He made a promise to his best friend, who had also grown up with Helen Spence, that together somehow they would tell the true story. Because after Helen Spence was murdered, her name was slandered and dragged through the mud. Well, how did she get to be in such a sad state? Back to True Grit. Helen Spence was a real-life version of Maddie Ross. When Maddie Ross avenged her father's death, she was somewhat of a hero, but that's a novel. Helen Spence went into the Arkansas County Courthouse and shot the man who killed her father during a fishing trip. She shot him in front of the judge, the jury, the spectators. People were leaping out the window, and my buddy L.C. Brown was on the front lawn playing kickball and saw it all go down. That was in 1930. So there began this inexorable swell toward a terrible defining moment where Helen wound up going to prison, even though, as they used to say in Arkansas County, he did need killing. He needed killing. Nevertheless, they sent her to the Arkansas Women's Prison. Now, the Arkansas Women's Prison is actually another thing, like Helen Spence, that had been lost to history all these years, and for good reason. But what happened was Helen became an escape artist. She kept escaping, and so the prison officials, they couldn't stand it, that here was this little river rat who was only 5 feet tall, wore a size 5 shoe, weighed 130 pounds or thereabouts, and was making them all look like idiots. So what did they do? They set her up, they took her down, they assassinated her, and they tried to cover it up. But they were even more clumsy with their cover-up than that New Jersey governor. It all came out. It all came out. It was ugly, and 3 people got the worst punishment that you could get during the Great Depression. They lost their jobs. But Helen was lost to history because so many things were said about her that were untrue. And the people in Arkansas County, it was so heartbreaking, they just wanted to forget. Meantime, it was the height of the Great Depression. People started getting kicked off the river. The tenant farmers and the sharecroppers, who were actually starving to death at the time because there were no social programs, they were getting kicked off the plantations for daring to unionize. There was this huge diaspora, and everyone was being displaced. And so in the chaos of that time, the story of Helen Spence was gone for just a sleep and a dream and a little while. And her tree, her best friend planted a tree on her grave, and that tree still stands, I'm happy to tell you. And one of the reasons that this book is so relevant to me is the fact that the readers of the book not only have managed to find a way to honor Helen Spence with a memorial at her tree, they've also discovered the literal foundations of the old Arkansas women's prison. So what got started in this slender book, it's a quick read, it's only 100 pages, but everything I've told you about is in here. How she lived, why she died so senselessly, and the injustice of it all, taking place against the backdrop of the Great Depression, when Arkansas was a crucible. It was the centerpiece, the epicenter of the Great Depression. We had the first food riot here in Arkansas. Maybe you don't know that because they don't teach Arkansas history in schools. I guess they're afraid that people will get too smart because everything you need to know about the universe is contained in the past